Let's talk Primaris Marines, Heresy tanks, and Noble Heroes and Power Armor. Today we're going to talk about every single Space Marine box set that Games Workshop currently sells. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're doing a fun project that I've been working on for quite a while, and today we're going to be looking at the vast majority of Space Marine kits that Games Workshop currently sells. I suspect that this is going to be a pretty meaty video, as there really are quite a lot of them. Over the years the Space Marine range has expanded massively, more people collect Marines than any other faction, so it does kind of make logical sense for Games Workshop to make more Marine kits as they get more sales that way. This has created a bit of a snowball effect over time, so you get more and more Marine miniatures in the range, and they have far more than any other faction. Broadly speaking, the plastic kits that you can buy for Space Marines are split between a few different sub-ranges. There's the newer and bigger Primaris Space Marines, a bit bigger, sleeker, and a bit more futuristic perhaps. Everything that came before that, the more standard Space Marine range with Tactical Marines and Devastators that people often refer to as Firstborn, and more recently Games Workshop have delved into the Heresy era Space Marines as well, mainly aimed at the Horus Heresy game, but all of their current plastics can be fielded in regular 40k as well, so we're going to look at those too. In today's video we are going to be focusing on the core Space Marine range, so basically any models that you can field in every single chapter rather than going down all the different sub-factions, or save things like Blood Angels, Space Wolves and other things for other videos, so feel free to let me know if you'd like to see any other content like this in the future. I'm also going to keep this to the core range from Games Workshop as opposed to the resin kits from Forge World as well. There are a lot of them, maybe that could be a project for another time. Finally, I'd bear in mind that a fair few of the Space Marine kits have either been just brought out as specific event miniatures, or have currently been rotated out of the range so you can no longer buy them anymore. That might be the source of a few kits that are missing, particularly some captains and characters and stuff. This video is going to be for the core Space Marine ranges from Games Workshop that they actually sell right now. For each unit we'll go over a few bits, the general quality of the kit, the cost in pounds, dollars and euros, and the amount of points that gets you on the tabletop per dollar invested, and a few other things about different options for the kit, any interesting features, and perhaps alternatives within the Space Marine range that you might want to pick up instead. Going to be a lot to talk about, so it should be pretty interesting. I will go through each of the sections of the codex in turn, starting with troops and then going on to elites, fast attack and the rest. Lots and lots to talk about, so let's jump straight into it. First up, let's start with troops, and here we have the Primaris Intercessors, £36, $60 or €47.50, and typically cost 200 points in game, so you get around about 3.3 points per dollar. I'd argue that's a fairly good number for Warhammer in general. The Intercessors are a standard issue Primaris, have a fairly sleek and uncluttered look, and I think they were generally quite popular when they were introduced at the start of 8th edition. They started out with quite a lot of monopose ones from the 8th edition starter set, and then this more multi-part kit came out, giving you some other interesting options like a bunch of aesthetic details, and different variants of bolt rifles. You can equip them with auto bolt rifles or stalker ones. I think the ones that these guys are stylishly modelling here are the auto bolt rifles, though to be honest the differences are kind of small in my opinion. If you're looking to pick up Intercessors, you might well want to look at the second-hand market. Things like eBay might have them cheaper, as they do come discounted in lots of the different combat patrols, and not everyone needs more of them. In-game they're pretty useful, good for holding the battle line and filling troop slots, though people don't tend to spam them too much. Next up we have the sneaky Primaris troops, the Infiltrators and Incursors, a dual kit for the same price as the Intercessors, and slightly higher points per dollar depending on exactly what you filled them as. The Infiltrators get you a few more points on the table than the Incursors, as they pay for those Omni Scramblers that mean that enemies can't come in from reserve near them. Typically they're around 3.6 points per dollar, again quite good. The main differences between the Infiltrators and the Incursors are different scanner things on the backpacks, slightly different gun scopes, and a different kind of flavour of helm. The Incursors seem to quite like these half helm affairs. In the not too distant future, these guys should have a kill team style box coming out that also has a bunch of different options for the unit, including the Helix Adepts that isn't currently included in this box, but will likely cost a little bit more. In general, for the look of the kit, I think they divide opinions a little bit. A lot of people like their tactical kind of look, very spec ops and serious military, but it is sometimes a little bit at odds with Space Marines. I can't imagine it's too easy to be sneaky in bright blue power armor. Again, like the Intercessors, they're a new Primaris kit, so are quite high quality in terms of the components and the way that it comes together, and they are pretty effective in game, screening out your force and providing OBSEC on crucial objectives. Moving on, we have the most recent Primaris troops kits, the Heavy Intercessors. You only get a box of 5 of these rather than a box of 10, and they're £40, $65 or €55, a bit more expensive than the others. If you take a heavy bolter, then they'll typically cost you 150 points in game, so a fair bit worse on the points per dollar front at only 2.3. For the rest of the video, I've decided to give that points per dollar ratio a pleasing different colour spot to see how much forces it'll get you in game. I'll give them an orange rating, and we'll go for red for worse and green for better. For these guys, you don't get any options on the sergeant or anything like that, but you do have again the similar option for different flavours of bolt rifle, and you have one marine that can build a heavy bolter, again 3 different flavours that have subtle magazine variants. Unlike both the infiltrators, incursors, and the standard intercessors, these guys haven't been discounted in any value boxes yet, so do cost a fair bit more. In general though, people did react quite well to the models. Basically big chunky space marines with pretty enormous looking bolt rifles I think are usually going to be pretty popular, though it did maybe feel Games Workshop was just jumping the shark a bit, just making all different flavours of intercessors, perhaps a bit more than they really need. In game, I think point for points they're not really much different to the standard intercessors, a little bit less damage for the points but a bit more durability. In general, people tend to prefer just the standard ones for holding objectives though, as they do a similar job for less points. Next up, we have the Close Combat Assault Intercessors, 10 models armed in Mark 10 Tacticus armour, but instead of bolt rifles, they're equipped with Astartes chainsaws and heavy bolt pistols instead. These guys are just a tiny bit more expensive than the standard intercessors, or the same price if you're in the US. A little bit worse in points per dollar than the standard intercessors, though it does depend on what sort of weapon you give the sergeant. In general, I feel like these guys are quite nice miniatures, quite a lot of little interesting aesthetic things like knives drawn and throwing grenades and stuff. No real major meaningful war gear options for the standard guys, though the sergeant does get quite a host of nice power weapons, including things like a power fist and a thunder hammer, and I believe that there's enough parts to make 2 sergeants in the kit if you did want to fill them as 2 individual squads. The sergeant can also take a plasma pistol or a hand flamer as well, which is kind of fun, though in game most people do generally just tend to keep them nice and cheap and arm them with Astartes chainswords to cut up infantry if they need to. Again, I think they've generally been very well received by people. Fairly standard looking Primaris Space Marines with chainswords, very nice for assault chapters like Blood Angels and such. Next up we have the Firstborn Troops Choice, the Tactical Squad, a staple of 40k since almost as long as it's existed. These guys cost £32.50, $55 or €42.50, a bit less than their Primaris brothers. They don't stand quite as tall as the Primaris, and their proportions are a little bit different. I think in general the majority of new players seem to prefer the Primaris models, though quite a lot of older players kind of just see these guys as the default, and the Primaris as the new different thing. In game, with certain special weapons that come to around 200 points in value, so have quite a good points per dollar ratio as it goes. They don't come with all the heavy weapons, just a missile launcher, but they do have one of each of the special weapons, plasma guns, melter guns, and flamers, and the sergeant does have the option of things like a combi weapon and a power fist. This kit was really quite a recent one, not released all that long before the advent of Primaris in 8th edition. They'd redone it quite extensively from the very long-standing one from the early 2000s. Overall, perhaps tactical marines are a little bit on the niche side in game at the moment, perhaps better suited to camping on objectives and things rather than pushing up the board. While we're on the troops, I thought we'd talk about the Horus Heresy Legion tactical squads, which are another interesting source of tactical marines in 40k. These guys can potentially get you a lot of marine bodies on the field for not all that much investment. First up, we have the new Mark 6 Legion tactical squad. This one, the new Beaky Marine set for this rebranded Horus Heresy they've just unleashed. You get 20 marines in this one with no special or heavy weapons, though the sergeant does get a plasma pistol, power fist, and lightning claw or power sword weapons. It is aimed mainly at heresy, though it's perfectly usable in 40k as tactical marines if you want to, or you could upgrade them with some devastators with some additional heavy weapon bits. There's a couple of other very similar Legion tactical squads, which we'll get onto in a second. These guys are the Corvus Marines with the beaky helmets, the ones with the pointy noses. Again, I think that these ones that some people love but some people aren't as big a fan of maybe fit a bit better with things like Raven Guard than certain other chapters. They're also quite big and chunky lads as well. Compared with the Tactical Marines and the other Heresy Legion tactical squads, these guys are just a little bit bigger and perhaps a little bit broader. I quite like the option for the bayonets and the chain bayonets as well, they're pretty fun. If you want loads of Marines on the board though, they are a fairly cheap way to get it. They're just under £50 or $80, and have a 4.8 points per dollar ratio if you do just want to fill them as tactical marines in 40k, which is quite good. Otherwise, we've got the Mark III Legion Tactical Squad and the Mark IV, pretty similar in a big 20 strong box of Marines. Again, a pretty cheap way to get lots of bodies on the board if you want to. The Mark III Marines are a bit different in that they're Mark III iron armour with a more industrial/knightly helms, and this kit does have a few more heavy and special weapons if you did want to field them as tactical squads. I think you get 2 heavy bolters, 2 plasma guns and 2 melter guns, plus a plasma pistol, fist, claw or sword for the sergeant. Lastly, for the Heresy Tactical Squad options, we've got the Mark IV Maximus armour. This one's the one that's got the helmets that are pretty similar to the Primaris ones, a fair few studded shoulder pads, and the backpacks that look fairly similar to the contemporary Marines. Option-wise, out of the Legion Heresy Marines, this one's perhaps one of the best of the bunch. You also get flamers in this kit, and heavy bolters or missile launchers for the heavy weapons, which is kind of fun, and plenty of options on the Sergeant, including a flexible combi weapon as well. So provided you like the aesthetic, these are probably one of the most efficient ways to get tactical marines on the board. Finally, for troops and big marine infantry sets, I thought we'd just mention these Heresy weapon upgrade sets that you can get for them as well. Fairly recent releases, these special weapons gets you a ton of rotary cannons, flamers, melter guns, plasma guns, and Volkite things, generally aimed to make Heresy special weapon squads, but I guess theoretically they could be used for spare bits for 40k. If you did need to convert a few special weapon bearers, I'd say perhaps the rotary cannons are particularly interesting for Chaos Space Marines, as they could be used to kit bash chain cannon havocs. Otherwise, and perhaps potentially more interesting for 40k, we have a missile launchers and heavy bolters set. These ones are designed to be compatible with the marine marks that we've just seen. You get 10 missile launcher bits and 10 heavy bolter bits, and if you did want to kit bash some devastators en masse, provided you're happy with these heavy weapons, then this is basically the cheapest way to do so from Games Workshop parts themselves. Both of the kits are £26, $42 or €32, which is quite a bit for heavy weapon parts, but if the alternative to this was buying 4 different Devastator squads, then you would come out ahead with one of these and one of the Heresy tactical sets, again provided you like the aesthetic of them. The heavy bolters and missile launchers are the Heresy appearance of them, a underslung heavy bolter and a slightly classic looking missile launcher. I think the missile launchers might depend on whether or not you like the retro look of them. Next up, we'll move on to elites, but while we're on the subject of buying Space Marines, I thought I might just quickly mention one of the things that keeps the channel going, which is my Element Games affiliate link down in the video description. If you happen to live in the UK and you were thinking about picking up any of these kits, I would bear in mind that the vast majority of them can be bought through third-party retailers, usually for a decent discount compared with Games Workshop. Element typically offers 15% off compared with Games Workshop's prices, and that can add up quite a bit with the price of Warhammer models, so in general I do thoroughly recommend buying through Element or another third-party seller if you are thinking about buying some models in bulk. The link is an affiliate link, so it does help support the channel as well. A small amount of the profits of the sale go to help Auspex Tactics too, but it doesn't cost you any more when you're buying whatsoever. It can just be one way to help support the channel while also saving yourself a bit of money if you were thinking about picking up some Space Marines anyway. Back to the Space Marine roster though, and we move on to elites. Next up we have the Scouts, moved from the Troops choice not so very long ago. There's 2 different Scouts kits available from Games Workshop. They don't make every single option in the box. Both of the kits are £21, $35 or €27, giving them a slightly mediocre to bad points per dollar ratio. The standard Scouts kit comes with most of the rough and ready options for actually engaging the enemy at close range, and then there's the option for the sniper kit in a second. This kit comes with bolters, combat blades and bolt pistols or shotguns, no special melee weapon options on the sergeant, though you could kit bash them if you want to, and the option of a heavy bolter but no missile launcher. As they go, I think that the Scout models are fairly simple, effective models. As the Space Marine range goes, they are getting on to be a slightly older kit, though I do remember them coming out and being an upgrade on the older Metal Scouts, and personally I felt that they were so much better than those. I'll admit they do have some slightly chiselled features on the faces, perhaps not the finest that Games Workshop's ever produced, but it is quite easy to get some good detail on them with some highlighting and shading. In-game they're slightly niche, but they can do okay screening out certain areas of the board, or filling land speeder storms which are very efficient. The other Scouts kit is the Scouts kit with sniper rifles. This one comes with the options to make 5 sniper rifle armed Scouts or arm one with a missile launcher. Perhaps not too bad as a combo, as it's a unit that's really going to want to sit back and lay down fire support. They also have the camo cloaks as well, for a little bit more survivability and cover. and otherwise are kind of similar to the previous Scout kit. These guys do come sporting some rather cool combat goggles though. The sniper fire isn't particularly efficient in the current Space Marine Codex, to be honest. For competitive lists, you're far better off with eliminators right now, though they are some pretty fun and iconic models. Moving on through the elite section, next up we have the Primaris Aggressors, £32.50, $55 or €42.50, and that gets you 3 of them, typically somewhere around $135, a little bit less if you give them flamers only. These are perhaps the archetypical Primaris and Gravis armour. They come with a couple of power fists, and then the options to either give them Boltstorm gauntlets and those Fragstorm grenade launchers on their back, or take off the grenade launchers and just gives them flamers to blaze away with on the fists. I do quite like the models, they're chunky and fairly dangerous looking Primaris Elites, and a pretty recent kit that came out towards the start of 8th edition, and is a bit better in quality than some of the older stuff. There was an easy build version at one point that came out with flamers, though largely that's gone, but you might find some on eBay or something. And in game I'd say they're a bit of a middling Space Marine unit right now. Not terrible as a mixed threat with a bit of range shooting and a bit of punchy melee, but perhaps not one of the best units in the Codex. Next we have the Blade Guard Veterans, one of the Space Marine kits that came out in 9th edition, £32.50, $55 and €42.50. They build you 3 Space Marine Veterans for 105 points, though that does mean that they're the worst points per dollar ratio so far at only 1.9. We first saw Blade Guard Veterans in the Indomitus box, so again there might be quite a lot on eBay. And you can also get them from Games Workshop through the Honor of the Chapter box set, which gets you the 3 Monopose ones. It is kind of an interesting kit with this one. There's really an absolute whole ton of ways that you can equip the Blade Guard Veterans. You can have them with pistols drawn and swords holstered, or swords and shields out and ready to fight the enemy. Really quite a surprising amount of aesthetic choices, given that most of them can only be equipped one way. To be honest, for me, I do kind of prefer just the standard swords out and shields out pros. I don't really have any more love for this kit than the monopose ones, to be honest, which again are very nice. But to be fair, in appearances, I do both like these and the monopose ones. Really quite cool Primaris veterans, going from a sleek and very uncluttered approach to kind of standard 40k over the top with a bunch of skulls and relic weapons and everything. In any case though, a very nice high quality plastic kit, and tons of options to make them look how you want. I'd bear in mind that you might be able to kit bash some of these from something like Cheap Assault Intercessors from the Recruit box set, just get your hands on some swords and some storm shields. In game they're pretty effective, good general purpose elite infantry that are very survivable with storm shields and access to transhuman physiology, rarely going to be a terrible choice in most armies. Next up we've got more Primaris with the Reavers, the same price as the Intercessors at £36, $60 or €47.50. You get 10 of these, and these guys are the spooky scary Primaris with the skull masks, aiming to be the Primaris Terror Troops. Wargear wise, you can either equip them with graph shoots to deep strike into battle, or grapnel launchers to jump up and down terrain. I do think that the guy who's firing the grapnel launcher is really quite a fun model. And in terms of weapons, you have the option of bolt carbines, or combat blade and bolt pistol, so a fair bit of flexibility with the squad. Again, these are Marines and Phobos armour, a bit more of the sneaky and Spec Ops type Marines, which some people like more than others. There are quite a lot of people though who really do like the skull helms. The Reavers have been discounted in rather a lot of Space Marine box sets. Again, they might be models that you could find fairly cheap on the secondary market. They perhaps sort of feel like a model that Games Workshop's pushed quite a lot, as they just didn't really ever sell that well. They've been saddled with pretty underwhelming rules ever since they came out, being Elite's choices that just don't deal all that much damage. Next up, we're back to the Firstborn Marines with the big and chunky Centurion squad. Again, these guys were one of the more recent Firstborn releases, £50, $80 or €65. Certainly quite expensive for 3 infantry models, even if they're quite big ones. I guess they do at least cost a fair few points in game though. Maybe around 200 points if you're fielding them as Assault Centurions, more than that if you're going for the Devastator loadout. Centurions were kits that drew a lot of people's ire when they came out. The initial reaction was, what if you had a Space Marine that was inside a Space Marine? They are basically exo armor that Space Marines wear. In their defense though, it's not exactly like 40k isn't full of big impractical stompy things. Maybe I've just got used to them, but I like them a lot more than I did when they came out. Model wise, these guys have an absolute ton of options. I did magnetize up a set of these, and it took an absolute ton of work just because they have 3 different options for Centurion guns. The great big siege drills for the Assault Centurions that can have either melter guns or flamers, and then several different options for the chest weapons, things like Hurricane bolters, missile launchers, or assault launchers. Weapon-wise, they're customizable to the extent that not many miniatures are, I suppose. Otherwise, though, their pose is maybe just a little bit on the static side, but I guess it's going to be hard to look any differently when they're in that amount of armor. Currently in game, the Devastator Centurions are a bit on the underwhelming side. Assault Centurions have had a bit of a comeback though since Armor of Contempt, relatively tough and ridiculous melee damage and anti-infantry shooting if you can get them up close. Next up we've got some Space Marine veterans in the Stern Guard, £36, $60 or €47.50. In the kit you only get 5 Marines, maybe 25 points each with a combi weapon, which I've just realised I have added up wrong there. It'd be 125 points, not 175, so a bit worse than the points per dollar that I've written here. Despite being a bit on the pricey side though, and not giving you that many models, you do get an absolute ton of bits in this kit. Some really quite snazzy and ornate firstborn bodies with a whole choice of shoulder pads, helmets and everything. And then really quite a lot of really cool weapon bits, 2 of each combi weapon plus storm bolters. The sergeant gets some melee options, and he can build a heavy bolter and a heavy flamer for the unit as well if you want a heavy weapon. As it goes, I think that this one's quite a popular kit, maybe not the worst to pick up for firstborn as it does give you a bunch of fun bits to equip other models with. Here are just a couple of pictures of the sprues. As you can see, a fair amount of options there between standard bolters and all the combis and things. Currently in game, they perhaps are one of the units that struggle for a place more than most. There are quite a lot of elite Space Marine infantry with bolters, perhaps not too bad with something like combi flamers or combi melters coming out of a drop pod, particularly if you're playing salamanders. Their counterparts for the combat veterans are the Vanguard veterans, a little bit cheaper than the Stern Guard kit at $32.50, $55 or €42.50. And as a kit for bits and cool spare parts, this one is pretty much their equal, if not even better. Depending on the loadout, these guys can cost really quite a lot of points. They've got an okay points per dollar ratio, and then again they come with loads of options. First up, you can field them with jump packs or FOT veterans. Jump packs are usually the way to go at the moment. And then they have a whole ton of combat weapons, 4 Thunderhammers, 4 pairs of Lightning Claws, 4 Storm Shields, plus some Power Swords, a Power Fist, Chain Swords and more. A lot of the parts are really quite ornate and interesting as well, good spare parts to have for converting characters or unit sergeants, and it's quite nice to have a kit that's quite so flexible and interesting. In game they perhaps are one of the rock stars of the Space Marine Codex at the moment, generally one of the best melee units around with their speed and hard hitting options. Currently a really nice firstborn option all around. Moving on, we have the Company Command Squad. In days past, Games Workshop used to sell these just with the Command Squad and not with the attached captain. Currently, with these 2 kits combined, they're £35, $60 or €45. The role of these has slightly changed over time. When 8th edition came around, they separated out the Apothecary, Company Champion and the Standard Bearer, all to be individual characters. The captain's also a fairly pricey character to field in game as well, and this means that you actually get tons of points in this box, and it's got one of the best points per dollar ratios out of any of them, a big 5.6, so it could be an interesting block for expanding a Space Marine army out on the cheap. Generally speaking, I feel like they're all okay miniatures, maybe not super standouts. The Apothecary, Ancient, and Company Champion all kind of feel like they're more squad upgrades rather than standalone characters, as they were sculpted as such, though I do think that the Captain miniature is quite a cool one, with that nice eagle helm. I believe that the captain's only armed with the plasma pistol and power sword though. He isn't a super flexible model like that other kit that they retired, and most of the other choices are slightly on the monopose side. Besides that, you also get a couple of company veterans with options for things like power fists, swords or special weapons, and in general in game it kind of depends on exactly which of these characters you need to buff the army or be combat characters. Apothecaries really are quite good in Space Marines right now, Ancients not so much, and the Company Champion can be a really interesting choice for some melee chapters. Next up, one of the archetypes of Space Marine elites, we have Terminators, and for standard Space Marines we've now got 4 different squads on option, the standard one, the Assault Squad, and the 2 different flavours of Relic Terminators. First up, we've got the standard issue Terminator Squad at £35, $60 or €45, typically clocking in at perhaps just under 200 points in value, giving them a pretty decent points per dollar ratio. The standard Terminator kit is one of the slightly older kits in the range, though I think it still holds up pretty well. In this one you get the guys with the storm bolters and the power fists, plus the option for a few heavy weapons such as cyclone missile launchers, assault cannons or heavy flamers. In game I'd argue they're not too bad at the moment, particularly for certain chapters. Armour of Contempt help these guys quite a lot. If you prefer your Terminators to get up close and personal, then there's the Terminator Assault Squad. The same price as the regular Terminators, and kind of similar in terms of what points you get. It depends on whether you give them the Lightning Claws or the Thunder Hammers and Storm Shields. There's the options to equip the entire squad either with the Claws or the Hammers and the Shields, and there is an alternate sculpt that you can get in the Blood Angels Terminator Assault Squad, which could be an interesting one if you want some slightly different aesthetics. Again, a slightly older kit as the Space Marine Firstborn range goes. The Terminator armour is thoroughly iconic, and again they'll do very well in certain chapters, particularly things like Dark Angel's Deathwing. The other options for Terminators that we have are the two flavours of Relic Terminator, the Tartarus and Cataphracti Terminators from the Horus Heresy. These ones are a fairly recent release, a repackaging of a kit that they came out with somewhere around 2015 I think. I think that they're slightly more recent sculpts than the other Terminator models. These box sets cost you £52.50, $85 or €67.50. A bit more than the others, but you actually get 10 Terminators rather than 5. So if you do like the look of them and you just want models on the table, then these guys will both do you well. The kits are a bit more aimed at Horus Heresy than standard 40k, though you can still field them with the Relic Terminator datasheet within the codex. Though if you just give them Storm Shields and Power Fists, I don't think anyone would have any problem with you running them as standard Terminators. Of the two, these ones are the Tartarus Terminators, so maybe the very slightly more slimline, if you can say that for Terminator armour, and a little bit more mobile. Weapons-wise, you have the option for Lightning Claws, Power and Chain Fists, and a fair few heavy weapons, including heavy flamers, plasma blasters, Reaper autocannons, and grenade harnesses. As with quite a lot of the Heresy releases, they look maybe a bit more slimmed down compared with the 40k stuff, and a bit more industrial and brutal as I feel. Relic Terminators are arguably one of the best variants at the moment in the Space Marine Codex. You do get quite a lot of flexibility on the datasheet, with unusual options like Lightning Claws and Combi Bolters as an option. In any case, they are another really good way of getting points of models on the board. Nice to see Games Workshop doing a little bit of discount if you buy in bulk. The other Heresy Terminator squad are the Cataphracti Terminators. I think of the two, I have seen more people preferring these over the Tartarus ones. They really do look very 40k with those enormous armoured shoulder pauldrons, and I think that they do look like pretty fun and intimidating models. Again, you get a lot of them for the same price as the Tartarus Terminators. They've got the option of Lightning Claws, Power Fists and Chain Fists and Combi Bolters, though perhaps a little bit less in terms of special and heavy weapons and things, just the two heavy flamers and the grenade harness I believe. Moving on to the rest of the elite slots, we've got rather a lot of Dreadnoughts and Walkers. First up, we've got the big and chunky Redemptor Dreadnought, the Primaris offering. He's £42.50, $70 or €55, typically costs just under 200 points in game, so 2.8 points per dollar ratio. I think the kit was aimed to be a bit more of a bigger and more practical version of the standard Space Marine Dreadnought. It's really quite a nice quality kit in my opinion. You've got a few fun options like being able to lift out the chest plate and expose the sarcophagus. And the thing does have really quite a lot of options as well. You've got the option between a macroplasma or a heavy onslaught Gatling cannon for the big gun, a flamer or another Gatling cannon attached to the fist, storm bolters or fragstorm launchers for the chest, and the option of that Icarus rocket pod on top. In general, I think people like these quite a lot, keeping the aesthetic of the old Dreadnoughts while making it a little bit more bigger and threatening looking. In game currently, they just happen to be one of the better Space Marine units, lots of reliable firepower with the core keyword. Next up, we've got the Stealth Walker that is the Invicta Tactical Warsuit, a little bit less than the Redemptor at £40, $65 or €55, though it does cost a fair few less points in game. The model is really quite heavily based on the Redemptor Dreadnought, kind of like a slimmed down Redemptor chassis with fewer armour plates. In theory, this thing is supposed to be sneaking up on enemy forces somehow. Weapon wise, you've got the option to swap out the right arm between an Incendium cannon and an auto cannon, and there are a few other aesthetic ways that you can switch things around, like opting to field that heavy bolter held in the model's left fist if you like, though personally I think it does look just a tiny bit awkward and is probably better left holstered for appearance in my opinion. Again, like the Redemptor, it's really quite a recent and pretty high quality plastic kit, really quite poseable. I think it got a little bit of mixed reception when it came out though in terms of appearance. A lot of people seem to think it looks quite like those walkers from the Avatar film. maybe a little bit more generic sci-fi than 40k Space Marine. In game, they're currently really good if you're Ultramarines, as you can redeploy them after putting them down. Otherwise, they do have the risk of being deployed up the field and then just being shot down if you don't get first turn. On to Firstborn Dreadnoughts, and first up we have the standard one. This guy's significantly smaller than the Invictor and the Redemptor, £32.50, $55 or €42.50, and might cost you around about 140 points in game depending on what you arm him with. Dreadnoughts can take a fair few options in the codex, but this one doesn't give you all of them. You've got the option of a las cannon or assault weapon on the one arm, and a missile launcher or close combat weapon on the left arm. The Dreadnought's certainly a kit that's been around a good long time, kind of an iconic 40k model, a big stompy walker of death with a sarcophagus in it. It maybe does feel like it's been one of the models that's been size and scale crept since it originally came out though. It's a little bit basic compared with more current plastic kits, and unfortunately just isn't really super strong on the basic datasheet in the codex at the moment. Perhaps its best use is firing out a bit of anti-tank firepower. You can get it rerolls with core and stuff. For just a little bit more, you can also pick up the Venerable Dreadnought as well. This one's basically a fancy and more embellished version of the standard Dreadnought, but it does come with quite a lot more gun options as well. The armor plates have a bunch of quite cool looking text embossed into it. The sarcophagus has a Space Marine helm at the top rather than just a vision slit, and in general the kit is a slightly nicer one. I think it did come out a fair few years after the standard Dreadnought one. Weapons wise, it also gives you the option of a plasma cannon in addition to the options that the standard Dread gets, and I believe that if you don't glue the parts in place, you should be able to swap out things like the missile launch arm and the combat weapon arm, which is quite nice for allowing you to field the model in different loadouts. Again, maybe kind of middling power in game. Again, it does best perhaps as an anti-tank turret that hits on 2+, with its missile launchers and las cannons. Next up for the Firstborn Dreadnoughts, we also have the Ironclad variant, again another kit that came out significantly after the first Dreadnought one, and a bit of a nicer, more polished kit with better detail as a result. This one's the same price as the Venerable Dreadnought, a tiny bit over the standard model. The Ironclad Dreadnought is intended to be the Siege Dreadnought, so it has got some fairly chunky looking armor plate, which a lot of people quite like the appearance of. And war gear wise, you've got the option of a number of really quite brutal and siege looking close combat weapons. You can see the seismic hammer and melter gun in the left arm there, and a dreadnought close combat weapon on the right. You've also got the option of a rather fun dreadnought chain fist as well, hunter killer missiles on the top, and a hurricane bolter. Again for this one you can swap out some of the loadouts if you don't glue them in place, I believe. And like the other standard sized dreadnoughts, it isn't enormously strong in 40k right now. It's not too bad in melee against vehicles and things, but it's just a little bit slow with a 6-inch move. Next up we've got a Relic Dreadnought offering in the Leviathan Dreadnought. These ones aren't in Codex Space Marines, but are instead in the Imperial Armor Compendium, mainly aimed for Horus Heresy, though they are quite popular models in 40k just because they look pretty awesome, and at least in the past edition they were really quite good in game. The Leviathan Dreadnought's a very recent release at time of recording. Games Workshop basically swapped the Forge World resin one for a new and shiny plastic one, and there's two different ways that you can get it, in a ranged version and a melee version, and upgrade kits available too. Both the range and the melee version cost you £47.50, $80 or €62.50, and nets you a fairly average points per dollar invested. This thing could be somewhere between 220 or 270 depending on what you load it with. Personally, I do really quite like the look of the Leviathan Dreadnought. It's aimed to be another brutal siege dreadnought, massive great big armor plating, some really heavy guns, and looks like a very dangerous little war machine to stomp towards the enemy with. Really nice to see it escape from resin and into glorious plastic. As the ranged version, this is the one that's armed with the Gravflux Bombard, Melter Lance and Storm Cannon, though it is kind of annoying that you only get one of each gun in the kit, meaning that you'd have to pick two of them to load it with, and you can't double up. You do also get the option of some top missiles if you want them as well, and the Volkites or the heavy flamers on the hull. I do suspect that this guy's going to be pretty popular. In game at the moment is not too bad. Does suffer a bit from not being core maybe, but at least the firepower that you get from him does compete fairly well with other non-core choices. If you prefer drills and claws to great big guns, then there's also the Melee Leviathan Dreadnought on offer. Again, that costs the same price. This one doesn't come with any big ranged options, but it does allow you to double up on the drills or the claws if you wanted, either way building a pretty fighty big and chunky dreadnought. These things are a very similar size to the Primaris Redemptor one. Finally, it is interesting that Games Workshop have decided to sell the Leviathan upgrade sprues separately. These ones are mainly designed if you do want to double up on guns, or if you want a gun plus a ranged option. You either have the melee option where you get the claws and the drills, or you have the ranged weapon options where you get one of each of the guns again. They're £16, $27 or €21, so around about a third of the cost of the Leviathan Dreadnought itself. Kind of depends on how much you merit wanting to mix and match war gear, or whether you're happy just to take two of the guns or the combat weapons that you get in the box. I feel like at least some people will find these useful, even if it always is just a little bit annoying paying quite a lot of money for just 3 guns or something. Maybe quite a nice one for the people who like to magnetize all the weapons and have all options open to them. Maybe not options that people are going to want if they're on a budget, but I think it is quite nice that Games Workshop makes it an option for people to get if it would be enough value for them to make it worth it. In a similar vein, we also have the fairly new Contemptor Dreadnought, £36, $60 or €47.50. Again, at least a fairly similar price to things like the Ironclad and the Venerable Dreadnought. This one, like the Leviathan, is a reimagining of one of the Heresy era patterns of Dreadnought. There is a datasheet for it in Codex Space Marines, though most of the options are again in that one in the Imperial Armor Compendium, the Relic Contemptor. In general, people do seem to quite like the appearance of the Contemptor Dreadnoughts. Another rugged Heresy design, and Forge World has made all sorts of different Dreadnoughts to represent the different legions. This one really is a replacement for the fairly rubbish Contemptor Dreadnought that Games Workshop sold before. That one was non-posable and had really limited options, whereas this one is highly posable and just has a ridiculous amount of guns available. It honestly does look like this is about one of the most customizable kits that Games Workshop has made in a long time. You've got the option of 8 different ranged weapons here, including fun things like Volkite and Conversion Beamers, plus a choice of melee weapons. I believe that you can configure this to be a dual melee dreadnought if you want. Combine that with really quite a nice posable and detailed kit, and I think they're onto a winner. These guys also cost a fair amount of points in game as well, which does mean that they have a fairly good points per dollar ratio if you're getting points on the board. Currently they're at least fairly solid in game, things like twin Volkites or twin las cannons plus some Cyclone missile launchers in 40k is generally fairly solid in terms of firepower for the cost. I would just bear in mind that similar to the Leviathan, if you want to double up on the same ranged weapon in both arms, you'd either need 2 kits or one of the upgrade sprues. Finally, I would also bear in mind that this guy also comes in that Age of Darkness Horus Heresy box, so that might be another way to get one second hand for people who are reselling theirs. I'm not certain if that one comes with all the options though. Similar to the Leviathan, Games Workshop also offers upgrade sprues for these Contemptors. There's one that gives you the option of the twin autocannons, las cannons, heavy bolters, or multi-melters, and one that comes with the options for the plasma Volkite, conversion beam, and assault cannon. These are priced just the same as the Leviathan one, £16, $27, or €21, though to be honest I don't think they're anywhere near as good a deal. Seeing as they cost almost half the amount of the Contemptor Dreadnought itself, I feel like you're probably just better off just getting a second Contemptor Dreadnought, and you have 2 bodies. Maybe magnetize the arms or something if you want to, and then you could field 2 different dreadnoughts with twin weapons if you needed. They just have to be 2 different sets of different ones, maybe one with 2 sets of las cannons and one with 2 sets of Volkites perhaps. Finally, for the elite section, we also have another character miniature. This one's the Primaris Ancient, £24, $38 or €31.50. I always think that character miniatures are in a bit of a weird place from Games Workshop. You do wind up paying an awful lot of money for just one quite small piece of plastic, but at least sometimes they aren't actually terrible in terms of points that you get on the board. This guy's a Primaris Banner Bearer and came out as an option to replace the one that came out of Dark Imperium that currently you can no longer buy. It was quite fun that they offered him a few more options when this updated kit came out. You've got the option of a power sword and a gun or some head swaps. The kit actually comes with 2 different variant banners, which you can see both of in this picture here. I guess maybe you could just about use one to kit bash a second Ancient out of the same kit if you wanted. Overall, I feel it's quite a nice little Games Workshop character miniature. Ancients really aren't super strong in game at the moment, but they are fun little models to paint, and it's quite nice to have some rule of cool standards on the board. Moving on, let's talk about jump packs, bikes and speeders with the Space Marine Fast Attack. First up we have the standard Firstborn Assault Squad, £32.50, $55 or €42.50, typically only costing around 90 points in game at the moment, giving them a pretty bad points per dollar ratio as it goes. I guess monetarily they cost about the same amount as Tactical Marines while only getting half of them, and they don't cost any more points in game now. Kit-wise, again it's one of the more relatively recent updated Firstborn Space Marine kits. It didn't come out all that long before Primaris did. In the box you've got the options of jump packs or regular backpacks, 2 plasma pistols and 2 flamers, a bunch of sergeant melee options, and a fun big chainsword called an eviscerator. Again, a pretty iconic 40k unit. Space Marines hurtling through the air into combat on jump packs really is quite a common theme in the lore. Kind of surprising that they haven't actually wound up making a Primaris version of them yet, though I'm sure that they will eventually. In game, they were previously quite bad, but the recent points drop has actually made them semi-decent. For a cheap little squad to jump around bullying infantry and doing objectives and things, you could do worse. Next up, we've got the Primaris Inceptor squad. Again, £32.50, €55 or €42.50. They cost somewhere between 120 or 180 points, depending on what guns you give them. The major option from the kit is that you have the choice of plasma incinerators or assault bolters, which do cost significantly different amounts, and basically determines whether or not they're being a bit more of a skirmish anti-infantry squad or something that could deal some massive damage. In this case, you also have the option of those visor grills with a vision slit that you can see on the two on the right, or the more standard Space Marine helmet on the left. And they perhaps are slightly unusual miniatures in big chunky Gravis armor marines with grav plates on their feet, yet still borne aloft by jump packs. I can't help but think that they do look a little bit ungainly, and I'm not sure that the grav plates on their feet really do that much for them. But it certainly looks like they're capable of delivering a lot of firepower. Kit-wise, they're recent Primaris kits from the start of 8th edition, so aren't too bad quality. Probably the biggest issue with them, though, are those flight stem bases. They're a curved plastic rod that go into the back of the model, and if you glue them, they do have a tendency to snap very easily. I've seen people have different solutions to this, including magnetizing the flight stem or using a bit of blue tack to hold them in place, but I certainly wouldn't consider the flight stems much of an asset to the model. In game, they're kind of a middling marine unit. You kind of get what you pay for in points. Bikes next, and here we have the standard Firstborn bike squad, £26, $42 or €34, giving you a squad that's 90 points in game. These guys are perhaps one of the most dated kits in the 40k range at the moment. Very simplistic models without any real significant options whatsoever. They're basically just 3 copies of the same guy. They even have the super old school Space Marine backpacks that came before the previous version of the tactical squad, and bolters that look like a bit of a throwback to the previous version of 40k. Very retro, can't say that the models are particularly outstanding in any way. In game they're okay for some expendable units to throw onto objectives very quickly. In a similar vein we have the attack bike, £21, $35 or €27. This one does at least have the option of the heavy bolter or the multi-melter. Another really quite old kit as it goes, and again hasn't really aged as well as some in the range I think. I must admit that the sidecar armed bikes always looked awkward to me. On top of that, they're really not all that good in terms of points per dollar invested. You need to spend quite a lot to get a significant amount of these in the list, but conversely they are at least a fairly efficient firepower in game at the moment. Fast multi-melters with the core keyword are kind of hard to go too far wrong with. Next up we've got the Invader ATV. This one very much felt to me like the Primaris version of an attack bike, a different setup but with a similar driver and gunner. This one's £27.50, $45 or €35, maybe around 85 points in game, and still not awesome on the points per dollar ratio. Options wise, it's kind of similar to the attack bike in a tank busting multi-melter or an anti-infantry Gatling gun. This kit came out around the start of 9th edition and is a fairly simplistic one. I think they're kind of fun little Space Marine dune buggies, but a lot of people just don't like the appearance all that much. I think the main things that they were saying when they came out was that it's just weird how unarmoured the front of the car is compared with the back, and there's been plenty of memes likening them to Mario Kart. In game, again I'd say they're fairly okay at the moment, they're not standouts. Fast units with a bit of firepower that you can zoom onto objectives, though I wouldn't expect them to do most of the heavy lifting. Next up we have the trusty Landspeeder, £24, $38 or €31.50 for another slightly classic looking Space Marine light skimmer. This one does vary a bit on depending on what you load it out with, could be anywhere between 70 to 110 points. You can build this as any of the different Landspeeder variants, either the standard multi-melter or heavy bolter, the tornado pattern with the underslung assault cannon or heavy flamer, which is quite easy to magnetize on or off, or the big Typhoon missile batteries that you can see on this one, with a bunch of big rockets stuck out of the side doors. Again, like the bikes, this one's a bit of a classic Space Marine sculpt, came for a very long time ago, and it's not really that different to the Landspeeder that came with the 4th edition box set. I think the only changes since then were the addition of the plastic guns and rockets. Still though, I don't think it's maybe aged quite as badly as the attack bike, perhaps appearance-wise. I'd bear in mind with these guys that the flying base is not one that you want to glue in, again unless you want it snapped off at some point. The model can sit quite happily on the base completely unglued. In game at the moment, single out land speeders with multi-melters again are quite popular for zooming onto objectives while doing a little bit of anti-tank work, cheap, fast and a little bit threatening. Next we've got the Storm Speeder, basically the Primaris reincarnation of the Land Speeder, significantly bigger, but maybe keeping the same general vibe as the Land Speeder with the grav plates, wings and great big engines. This guy's $42.50, $70 or €55, costs a fair bit more than Land Speeders at 145 points and has a similar sort of points per dollar ratio. The Storm Speeders have some guns mounted on a back turret, some out the sides, and a main weapon out the front, and can be set up either as the anti-infantry hail strike or the anti-tank and anti-flyer hammer strikes and thunder strikes. Appearance-wise, it does keep the same sort of flying brick kind of vibe as the standard land speeders. The details are perhaps a bit crisper, and the kit's a bit more thoughtfully put together, seeing as it's a very recent one. Though I have seen people saying just how deaf the guy who's sat between the two great big high caliber Gatling guns must be. I can imagine it must get pretty noisy back there. In game, they've had a few points drops recently, but just aren't really considered quite as good as the land speeders. The main issue is that while they have a similar sort of damage and defensive profile, they're just not quite as expendable, which is something that you often quite want in fast attack units. Scout bikes next, and these ones are £24, $38 or €31.50. You get 3 of these neophyte Space Marines on bikes. I believe again that they're all the same model in a similar vibe to the standard bike squad, and they cost the same amount of points in game. On the kits you do have a few different options. You can either choose to field them with the shotguns that you can see pictured here, or pistols, and you can swap out one of the twin bolters for a grenade launcher. Again, as they go, there may be a slightly older plastic kit, a bit more basic than the current ones. If it were me, I probably wouldn't bother putting those aerials on the back of them, they'd snap off at the touch of a feather. Currently not particularly exciting compared with standard bikers right now. Generally the extra wound and better save is seen as superior compared with the extra shooting that these guys get from their shotguns. Lastly, for the fast attack kits, we've got the Primaris Outriders, a really quite big and chunky Space Marine bike squad. To all intents and purposes, an updated version of the standard bike kit. Armoured bikes with some big guns sticking out the front and a few chainswords on the riders. They went down in points a little bit to 135, which is quite good as I thought they were kind of overcosted before. Model wise, I think they look okay. Really quite nice miniatures if you're playing White Scars or Ravenwing or something, I guess. Though as Primaris kits go, they are fairly simple, kind of monopose without any meaningful options. I think it would have been nice to give the Sergeant the option of power weapons or something. I'd bear in mind that these guys have featured in the Indomitors box, and they do come in that Elite starter set. It might mean that there's the potential for people on eBay to be selling them a bit cheaper than normal. Moving on, we come to the Space Marine heavy support sets. First up, we've got the Devastator Squad, another very iconic Space Marine unit, £35, $60 or €45, and that gets you 5 Space Marines with heavy weapons, plus this cute / hideously creepy Armorium Cherub. Again, like the Assault Marines and the Tactical Marines, these were quite a nice kit that came out in one of the latest waves of Firstborn Space Marines before Primaris came about. The kit's a really nice one for bits if you are collecting Firstborn Space Marines. It comes with a whole ton of heavy weapons with 2 grav cannons, 2 missile launchers, 2 multi-melters, heavy bolters, plasma cannons and las cannons. On top of that, there's really quite a good choice of options for the Devastator Sergeant as well, and basically whatever way that you build this kit, you're going to be left over with a whole ton of fun spares. If you're getting a Devastator kit, I'd be kind of tempted to stretch it out a bit, potentially combine it with getting a Tactical Marine kit, or maybe even some of those Legion Heresy Marines, and you can use all the extra arms and backpacks and things to kit bash really quite a lot more heavy weapon specialists. I would bear in mind though that you can't make 4 of the same heavy support weapon from the same box. You would need 2 if you say wanted 4 grav cannons or something. In game they're not too bad at the moment. In general, these more standard las cannons and missile launchers firing from long range isn't quite as favoured. Space Marine lists seem to make quite good use of them dropping out of drop pods with things like grav cannons and multi-melters to engage the foe at slightly closer range. Next up we've got some Primaris squads, the first one being the Eradicators, $32.50, $55 or €42.50. That gets you 3 chunky Gravis Space Marines armed with some heavy duty melter rifles and the option to equip one with a multi-melter for even more burning goodness. These guys were introduced at the start of 9th edition and came in the Indomitors box set, and for a while were perhaps one of the most overpowered units in the game. If you're lucky, you still might find some Indomitors ones going a little bit cheaper, and they do also feature in that Honoured of the Chapter box set, which we'll get onto later. In general, I think that the miniatures look okay, big chunky Gravis Marines with some guns, not bad heavy weapon specialists I get. Currently in game they're still very efficient anti-tank, though maybe aren't quite as ridiculously powerful as they used to be when they first dropped. Next up we have Eliminators, again a trio of Primaris fire support infantry, and these guys cost the same as the Eradicators. Currently in game though, they only cost you 75 points no matter which loadout, giving them just about the worst points per dollar ratio out of any so far on the list. If you want Eliminators at a discount, I'd bear in mind that they feature in that Combat Patrol Space Marines box set, though in that one you do only get the sniper rifles, not the las fusils. Model wise, they're quite nice stealthy Spec Ops Primaris in camo cloaks with sniper rifles or anti-tank weapons. The sergeant can take an Instigator Bolt carbine, which allows the squad to do some movement tricks, and I think in general they've gone down quite well. A little sniper unit that looks very at home camped in cover, trying to plink off some enemy commanders while staying safe with those camo cloaks. I do think the miniatures look quite cool myself. Currently in game, I'd say they're one of the strongest Space Marine units right now. Their points drop means that they're just very efficient with las fusils and can be quite good as a screening unit as they're just so cheap for the three of them. To be honest, they've been at least fairly strong in game ever since they were released in the middle of 8th. Moving on, we have the Hellblaster squad, from Primaris infantry armed with the plasma incinerators. What's not to like about a whole bunch of Primaris Space Marines armed with dangerous plasma weapons that have the chance to blow themselves up or cause some serious hurt on enemy heavy infantry? These cost the same as the Intercessors, £36, $60 or €47.50, but because they're armed with exciting plasma weapons they cost loads more points and are actually one of the single best points per dollar ratios out of the Space Marine army. There really aren't many kits in 40k that get you 5.5 points per dollar, so it could be an interesting option for expanding an army quickly on the cheap. Kit-wise, the unit comes with 3 different options of plasma incinerators. Again, I would say that the differences in appearance are kind of small, like the Intercessor bolt rifles. There are a few head swaps, and you can give the sergeant a plasma pistol as well, just in case he didn't have enough plasma goodness with his big gun. Really quite a fun unit, fairly standard Space Marines as they go, very similar to the Intercessors, and in general I think that people seem to find them pretty cool. Currently in game they are again a kind of middling unit, the firepower just isn't amazing for the points cost right now. Some people do manage to find a bit of success with the Assault Plasma Incinerators with lots of shots, but they certainly don't see all that wide play. Some artillery big gun pieces next, and next we have the Fire Strike Servo Turret, a Tech Marine crewed Primaris gun platform that can either have an autocannon or a close-range las talon. This one again is a fairly basic and pretty monopose kit, £21, $35 or €27, a little bit of fire support that hits on 2s, though nothing too outstanding for the points cost at the moment. I think a couple of these just hanging around at the back of your army, laying down some accurate fire is quite fun though. I think it's quite interesting that the Tech Marine gunner is actually plugged into the turret itself. That feels very 40k and grimdark to me. Next up, we've got the Thunderfire Cannon, £40, $65 or €55. In this one, you get a Tech Marine gunner miniature and a small tracked artillery piece without a base, a little barrage weapon that can stack some hurt on infantry units or potentially slow down certain units using a stratagem. This one's not a plastic kit, it's one of the relics that's made in fine cast resin, fine cast being in inverted commas as there's often flaws with it. Where core GW is concerned, fine cast resin is definitely a negative, not a positive. I feel like these guys probably aren't going to be the most popular miniature right now. Not a great material, not a bad miniature, but maybe not one of the most exciting in the Space Marine range. You don't get many points per dollar, and in game they just really aren't all that effective right now. Space Marine tanks next, and first up we have the Primaris Gladiator, $52.50, $85 or €67.50. I must admit getting a bit on the pricey side for what basically aims to be a line battle tank for the new and shiny Space Marines. It does put it slightly on the lower end of the points per dollar ratio, so clocking in somewhere between 150 and 200 after the points cuts. The kit can build either the long range Lancer, the close range and dangerous anti-tank Valiant, or the Gatling gun armed Reaper. You also get the option to bolt on an Icarus pod and a heavy stubber if you want a few more guns on the top. The Primaris tanks generally have these grav plate type things, kind of similar to the land speeder. I think some people like that aesthetic a bit more than others. Hover tanks are kind of cool, but a lot of people think that the Space Marines should just be going along with the tracked versions of tanks, and it makes them a bit too much futuristic, like Tau or Eldar maybe. The Primaris tanks do tend to be a bit busy, with lots of detail going on all over it. think the Gladiators are maybe a little bit more focused than things like the Repulsor personally, and seems a fairly fitting battle tank model for the faction. I believe if you did want to put in a bit of legwork as well, you can potentially magnetise some of the options so you can effectively field an Impulsor out of this kit. I've seen a few tutorials for doing that going around online. In game, they're kind of middling non-core firepower, certainly a lot better following multiple points cuts, but often things like Eradicators or Redemptor Dreadnoughts are still taken in their stead. Next up, we've got the Repulsor. Kind of interesting that this is basically the same cost as the Gladiator tank, considering it is really quite a much bigger kit. It does have a fairly decent points per dollar ratio at the moment, though that's partly because it's probably overcosted a bit in-game for what it does and what it brings to the board. I think their original design philosophy for the Repulsor was something to be akin to the Land Raider, though what they actually wound up coming out with was kind of different. The biggest criticism I see with this one is that it just doesn't really look all that focused. It's got too many guns jutting out at odd angles, and nothing really to bring the whole thing together. The turret, I must admit, looks a little bit ridiculous. Just above a big hole-mounted weapon, you've got las cannons next to a coaxial heavy stubber, a bunch of different grenades sticking out at odd angles, then even a Gatling gun turret on the top. It is quite a customizable miniature though. Most of those guns can be swapped out for different guns. Unfortunately, in-game they're just not that great in the current codex. Otherwise, you've also got the Repulsor Executioner as well. This one's significantly more at £65, $110, or €85. It does cost a tiny bit more than the standard Repulsor in game, though not that much. The main difference between this and the standard one is the addition of a really big gun, either a laser destroyer or a macro plasma incinerator. That's combined with a heavy onslaught Gatling cannon on the turret, and it makes it look a bit more focused, I think. An inordinately big gun draws the tank together a bit more compared with lots of little guns sticking out at different angles. Again, really not super strong in game right now, but perhaps a better looking Primaris big tank in my opinion. Next up, we've got the Firstborn armour. The two different Predator tanks are represented by the one kit, and you can choose to build it as the Destructor or the Annihilator. The option between a las cannon or auto cannons on the turret, and las cannons or heavy bolters on the side sponsons. The Predator is again a really classic Space Marine tank, kind of iconic for the faction, and was the kit that I think that the Gladiator was basically trying to ape, being a hover Predator basically. Model-wise, the parts are a little bit simplistic and dated compared with some of them. It does just basically go off the Rhino chassis that's been around for ages, though I still think it's a pretty effective looking kit on the table right now. Again, like quite a lot of Space Marine tanks, not really all that effective on the table at the moment. If the Chaos Space Marine Codex is anything to go by, at least the las cannon should get a bit of an amp up in the next codex. Moving on, we've got the part bulldozer and part siege tank that is the Vindicator. £40, $65 and €55, same as the Predator. You do have the option for whether or not you assemble it with that great big bulldozer siege shield, though personally I do think it would look a bit sad not to. Really quite a fun little vehicle, I think. I've certainly had a good use out of mine. Rumble it down the centre of the table, and it's going to be fairly tough to take up a fair bit of enemy firepower, even if that Demolisher cannon is kind of unreliable with how much damage it will do. The Whirlwind next, another option with some different guns on top of a Rhino chassis. This one bringing the big Whirlwind Castellan Vengeance launchers for a little bit of Space Marine artillery ignores line of sight. It's a little bit cheaper than the Predator and the Vindicator, though not by an absolute ton. Not a huge amount of options on this one, the main one to swap out the appearance of the missiles depending on which ones you want to represent. Another classic Space Marine tank kit. In game its damage output is kind of bad, but it does actually have some good use for using one of its stratagems to slow down enemies and make them fight last in combat or be unable to overwatch. Not too bad to fire at something that you're just about to charge some elite troops into. Next up we have the trusty Land Raiders. There's two different kits from Games Workshop for these guys, either the Crusader and Redeemer kit pictured here, or the next one which is the standard las cannon one, which is a bit cheaper. The Crusader or Redeemer is the same price as the Repulsor Executioner, £65, $110 or €85, getting you 245 points of tank or thereabout. Model-wise, it uses the same basic chassis as the Land Raider. I do quite like the way that you can open and close the front assault ramp. That's always been quite a fun little feature for me. You can rotate the side sponsons as well, and this one gives you the option of either big Flamestorm cannons or the Hurricane bolters on the Land Raider Crusader. Land Raiders are a thoroughly iconic Space Marine tank. Rumble them up the board and have a whole load of elite infantry disgorged to charge down the enemy. In game they haven't really been very good for the most of 9th edition, at least they've got some more points cuts now, so a tiny bit more efficient if you do want to field one. The other option for the Land Raider kit is the standard one with the heavy bolters and the las cannons. This one's significantly cheaper, the same price as the standard repulsor, still is a bit better in terms of points per dollar, and I'd argue is probably stronger than the other variants in game right now too. This one doesn't get the option of the multi-melter, so you need to convert one on the top if you wanted one. This kit's maybe a little bit more dated and simplistic than the previous Crusader and Redeemer one, but there's not really that much in it. I guess it might cost a little bit less because it's got fewer options, and I think it's direct only from Games Workshop web store, so you can't get this guy at a discount. Next up, we've got a few more Heresy themed goodies. This one, the Sicaran Battle Tank, a very recent release from Games Workshop at the time of recording. This one is the update to the resin Forge World Sicaran Battle Tank, costing significantly less at the same price as that new Leviathan Dreadnought, and I think really quite a popular and good looking Space Marine tank as they go. It's designed to be a fairly fast main battle tank with those two sets of tracks. It does look fairly dynamic, and similar to a fair few of the Heresy kits, this one's a little bit more niche in 40k, found in the Imperial Armor Compendium for rules rather than the Marine Codex. Options wise, this one builds the main Sicaran battle tank, the one with the big autocannons that you can see here. Forge World do have a lot of different options for different turrets and things. They're still made of resin and very expensive. You do get really quite a lot of pintle mounted options though for the top hatch, and 4 different choices of weapon sponsons for those side ones if you want them. Currently in 40k, the Sicaran series of battle tanks are okay. The 2+ save works quite well with Armour of Contempt, though I don't think that they're enormously outstanding compared with other sources of firepower. One of the newcomers to the Space Marine range is the Kratos Heavy Assault Tank. This one's a bit more expensive at £75, $125 or €100. It basically aims to be a new heavy tank for the Marines, perhaps a similar sort of class and weight scale to the Repulsor Executioner maybe. The thing costs 320 points in game, so it's fairly middling in terms of points for the money, and if you want its rules you currently download them from Games Workshop directly. I'm sure they'll be folded into Imperial Armor or Codex Space Marines eventually. This one does look superficially quite similar to the Sicaran tank, but it is a fair bit bigger. The tracks are kind of similar, but it has a few more hull-mounted weapon options, plus another really big gun. This one does have options to build a main battle cannon, a melter weapon, or a big Volkite. On top of that, it does come with this rather enormous dozer blade as well, if you like the look of that one. I think I've seen mixed opinions as to whether or not they like that or not. Big tanks with dozer blades are fun, but I think it would look pretty good without. I think largely this one's been received pretty well by the community, a nice addition to the Space Marine Heresy range, a tank halfway between a regular battle tank and a super heavy. In game, its firepower isn't too terrible for the points cost for an encore vehicle, particularly the melter weapon does look kind of interesting. Finally, for big thunderous Heresy tanks, we have the Spartan Assault Tank. This one's slightly less than the Kratos interestingly, at £67.50, $112 or €87.50, and it's basically a great big embiggened Land Raider with a different style of treads, plus a big battery of quad las cannons on either side. It's fun to see another Forge World resin beast reincarnated in plastic. It's much cheaper than it used to be and in a much nicer material. And at time of recording, I would bear in mind that they've been coming in that Age of Darkness starter set for the Heresy, so that you can get them at significantly cheaper than you can just from Games Workshop. Plenty of them look like they're going on eBay, for people who perhaps didn't want them out of the big box set. Rules-wise, this one's currently classed as a Space Marine Lord of War, so is a super heavy for 420 points, and therefore does get you a fairly decent points per dollar ratio. I can't say it's really all that much worth it in game though. Despite having some quite fun guns, it really isn't all that much tougher than a regular Land Raider and costs loads more. I believe that this one doesn't also come with laser destroyers, which are an option on the 40k datasheet as well, though it does have a lot of choice of hull-mounted guns and pintle options. In any case though, really quite a cool and big thundering Land Raider. Next up we have the Space Marine Flyers, and there's basically 3 options in the Codex, the first of which is the Storm Raven gunship. I've generally always found this guy to be a pretty fun model. It's basically aimed to be a mini version of the Thunderhawk gunship for Space Marines, something that few collectors would ever be able to own, and it is pretty cool to have a mini one of those flying around the battlefields on the tabletop, making daring drops for your elites into the heart of the battle. Price-wise, it's £67.50, $112 or €87.50, a fairly average points per dollar as it goes, and you do at least get a fairly big kit to have winging around on the board. Perhaps some of the interesting details are the fact that you can rotate the turrets and potentially magnetize out the weapons if you wanted. You've got the option of heavy bolter sponsons on the doors, a choice of different front-mounted weapons, again which can be moved, and the Space Marine Flyers do also feature these little perspex cockpits as well, which can be just a little bit of a hazard when you're assembling them. You need to be careful not to fog them with glue or get paint on them, otherwise the glassy effect can be a bit sad. It is quite cool to see a painted pilot though under the canopy, and you can always just do some sort of glassy type effect and paint over the cockpit if you want to. The base is one of these tall cross flyer stand type things. It does insert and lift off quite easily for the model underneath, which is pretty handy for storing it, otherwise it'd be really impractical. In game, sadly Storm Ravens are kind of bad at the moment. The speed and firepower isn't too bad, but they just cost a bit much for how easy they are to kill. The other options for marine flyers are the Storm Talon gunship or the Stormhawk interceptor. Sorry, not the Storm Raven there, that was the previous one. These ones are a combination kit that build either one of the planes, though because of the different ways that the two flyers are set up, they're not quite as easy to magnetise out between the two of them. The kits are fairly similar to a lot of the Space Marine tanks, £36, $60 or €47.50, typically costing something like just under 200 points, and not too bad in terms of points on the table. Model-wise, you've either got the Interceptor with the twin assault cannons on the wings, plus missile backup and some front-facing guns. You really can be firing a lot of shots out of that thing, or the Storm Talon that can go around hovering, but doesn't boast quite as much firepower. Models-wise, I think they're fairly fine. The Storm Talon in particular does look a little bit stubby, I guess. I've seen a few people liken it to a flying smart car. Maybe seems a little bit more akin to a helicopter than a plane, I guess. In game, again with the Storm Talon, they aren't super outstanding. They pay a lot for their mobility, and their damage and defense just doesn't quite live up to that. Next up, some transport vehicles for getting your Marines from A to B. First up, we've got the dual kit of the Rhino or the Razorback, £30, $50 or €40. Depending on how you build it, it might be around 100 points per game, a bit less if you field the Rhino. The Rhino is a model that's kind of ubiquitous to 40k, a very distinctive silhouette that's aped with all sorts of vehicles across the game. Lots of the Space Marine tanks that we've already seen, plus things like Sisters of Battle vehicles, Chaos vehicles, and as a transport for other Imperial factions as well. Again, it's a kit that's slightly on the older side, but to be honest, for a basic transport vehicle, I'm not sure that's the biggest deal. It's maybe not one of the ones that needs to be super flashy. One thing that people have pointed out about the Rhino, though, is that for the size of it, it's theoretically supposed to be able to transport 10 Space Marines, and there's just no way that you'd be able to have that many Space Marines inside of it without them being stacked on top of each other in some sort of Jenga formation. Perhaps not quite as carefully thought through on the scale front, I guess. As well as the Rhino, you can also build the Razorback from the same kit. This one gives you the option of the heavy bolters and the las cannons, but not the assault cannons. And I think in quite a nice feature, it's really quite easy to swap out the top hatch either for the Razorback or the Rhino hatches. So you could have one tank and use it as both depending on whether or not you want some big guns or not. As an alternative, you can also get the Deimos Rhino Heresy Sprue that we'll take a look at in just a second. And in something that I found quite interesting, I have noticed that those Razorback turret sprues do tend to sell for at least a fair bit on eBay, meaning that you can net yourself a fairly cheap Rhino if you do want to resell the sprue. Again, another option for getting Rhinos might be to get the Whirlwind kit, and then that could give you the option of that one if you wanted to swap out the top hatch as well. As mentioned, the other option for the Rhino is the very recent sculpt of the Deimos pattern Rhino, the one that's aimed more at Heresy era. It is really quite interesting to see Games Workshop release an updated version of the same kit, but for cheaper than before. £28, $47 or €37 is quite nice. I guess maybe it's to reflect that they don't cost that many points in game. Plus maybe that you don't get the Razorback options on this thing, which will put it at lower value than the standard 40k Rhino for quite a lot of people. The kit is the same size and shape as the standard Rhino, though it just basically has a lot of different aesthetics. The kit was deliberately aimed to hark back to the previous Rhino kit, the ancient one that predated the one that we've just seen, and a lot of the details on it have classic or pre-heresy type vibes, rounded doors, the split front armor plates, and 2 different bolt guns mounted on 2 different hatches, and a bunch of different details. I think objectively there isn't really all that much difference between this one and the standard Rhino. It just depends on whether or not you like the classic aesthetic of this one, or the more contemporary 40k aesthetic of the other Rhino. Kit-wise, I do think that this one is probably slightly superior. Regardless of the aesthetic, the execution is a bit more well modelled. In terms of extra stuff, it has a whole ton of things for the pintle-mounted war gear, including some interesting choices like a multi-melter, but doesn't have the Razorback options. Still though, certainly an interesting option for Rhinos if you want one, particularly as it's a bit cheaper than the other one. Moving on, we've got the Drop Pod, everyone's favourite vehicle to fire Space Marines down from orbit and take the fight right to the heart of the enemy. This one's £30, $50 or €40, and you do get really quite a big meaty plastic kit with this thing. Though being a cheap transport vehicle without any guns or anything, it is fairly bad on the points per dollar ratio. In terms of options, you've got either the choice of a storm bolter or a Deathwind missile launcher. The doors can all open and close, and when you do get one together, it does look fairly effective on the board. Slam this down onto the board and have your Space Marines pile out. It looks pretty cool to represent some deep strike. Kit-wise though, I would bear in mind that drop pods are slightly infamous in 40k. They are a bit of a pain to assemble, with essentially a mirror surface in 5 different directions. You need to get all of those lined up properly, otherwise you might have some gaps. It can mean that the doors have a little bit of trouble opening and closing sometimes, and then when you do have the thing together, it is possibly one of the single most annoying miniatures in 40k to paint. There's just a ridiculous amount of surface area both inside and outside if you haven't glued the doors. And I certainly can't say it feels like one of the most rewarding miniatures to spend loads of time and effort on from personal experience. In game, they're probably not quite efficient enough for mass use at the moment, but people do have some good value out of them from delivering Devastators in a big alpha strike on turn 1. They do get some fairly common play that way. Next up, we have the Primaris Transport in the Impulsor. £47.50, $80, and €62.50. I must admit, I do find this one pretty expensive for what in theory is the basic transport for the Primaris Marines, significantly more than say an Intercessor squad which you can only transport half of. It is pretty bad on the points per dollar ratio at only 1.6, certainly worse than most there. Kit-wise, it is a fairly recent Primaris one with quite a lot of options though. You've got the option for a heavy stubber and different side guns, and it basically has the appearance of an open-topped Primaris flatbed Rhino, with a few from weapon and upgrade options that you can mount on the top hull, such as the Icarus guns here, and there's options for missile launchers, comms arrays, and shield domes. If you do want to get your hands on these, you might well consider the ones that come discounted in the Combat Patrol box sets. There's really quite a lot of them going around there, and they're almost certainly going to be going cheaper on eBay than this. If you just want a basic one without the top guns as well, you could maybe get a Gladiator tank which is only a little bit more, and maybe magnetise out the top turrets. In game they have a fun rule where they can move and then disembark their transport contents, can get things across the board quite a lot, but it does cost quite a lot of points to do so, and they really are quite niche right now. Finally for the transports, we've got the Landspeeder Storm, the transport choice for Space Marine Scouts, £24, $38 or €31.50. This one's a very cheap little Space Marine skimmer at 50 points. It's basically a land speeder with an open crew compartment that you can use to have some scouts perch on. I think it's quite a fun idea to be honest. You can have your scouts zooming along and fire guns out of the land speeder Storm as it moves around. The kit itself comes with a whole bunch of scout miniatures which you can assemble perched on the footplate as you can see here. If you wanted to, you don't have to put them on and you can assemble the land speeder Storm without those extra scouts in it, and potentially kit bash them with some extra bases to make some more scout models. Otherwise it doesn't really have any significant weapon choices besides the heavy bolter and Cerberus launcher. In game they are fairly efficient little cheap expendable skimmer transports. Even in Nephilim when there's the requirement to have a unit inside it, it still seems to have some use zooming scouts up towards the midfield, and being a cheap expendable threat to get some scouts and bodies onto the midfield objectives. Next we've got the Space Marine Hammerfall bunker. This one is another relatively recent one that came out in 9th edition, a Primaris Fortification that costs £36, $60 or €47.50. The thing's basically a gun turret that sits in your own deployment zone and throws out a lot of shots against all units in range, though not very good ones. It's not too bad on the points per dollar ratio, and the kit is fairly chunky and I think fairly cool looking. It kind of reminds me of buildings from StarCraft. I think perhaps the most disappointing thing about it rules-wise is that it clearly looks like it's a drop pod type equivalent that could be deployed from orbit, but it has to be deployed normally and it can't deep strike in, which I think would have given it a fair bit more of a fun factor. Options-wise, you get a really big missile launcher on the top, and then either heavy bolters or heavy flamers on the sides. As Space Marine terrain and fortification goes, I think it looks the part, but currently its rules are just super bad in game. It's one of the worst units in the Space Marine Codex in my opinion. Moving on, we have the HQ choices, and as mentioned at the start of the video, we will just be going over the generic ones in this one. We're not going to be going over special characters from different chapters. Still, Space Marines being Space Marines and having so many options available, there really are an awful lot of ones to choose from. First up, we've got the Tech Marine and Servitors, £28, $47 or €37. This one is an older resin kit, and Games Workshop resin is kind of known for having some issues with miscast or warped components. For this one, you get the Tech Marine in the full servo harness that you can see here. and then a bunch of servitors, 2 with guns and 2 with servo arms. I think actually as character kits go, it really isn't too bad for the money. A lot of Games Workshop's characters just come with the one miniature for a fairly similar price to this, so getting a mini squad alongside your Tech Marine I think is okay. The other option for Tech Marines is the Primaris Tech Marine, and I guess you might consider the Space Wolf's Iron Priest as well. He's got a similar model that does have some wolf emblems on him. I think the Primaris Tech Marine is a fairly effective miniature, a great big Omniscient power axe, a nice heavy bolter to blaze away with on the shoulder, and a rather cool looking servo arm and grav pistol. He's £24, $38 and €27, what seems to be a very standard price for more recent Space Marine character releases. The points per dollar ratio isn't amazing though, and of course with GW characters you're still only getting one quite small plastic miniature. In general, not the most material for the money. Next, I guess technically belonging in the elite section, is the Primaris Apothecary. Similar prices to the Tech Marine, besides a bit more expensive in euros. This guy does feel a bit more of an actual character miniature as opposed to a squad filler like the Command Squad one. He's even got a full-on Space Marine on his base to recover the Gene Seed off. Options wise, he's got the option of a helmeted head and some different surgical tools on the back I think. And as he goes I think he's quite a nice and detailed Primaris miniature. No real complaints on the sculpt for a medic miniature in my opinion. In game they can be pretty handy as well with certain units, particularly anything that can be resurrected from the dead with their stratagem, and bringing back quite a lot of points to the table. Next up we have a trio of chaplains. Besides these there are a few faction specific ones such as the Blood Angels Jump Pack Chaplain, which is quite cool. For the generic range though, we've got the standard plastic chaplain on foot, the Primaris Chaplain and the Primaris Chaplain on bike. The firstborn one is cheapest, then the Primaris one, then the biker. Models wise, the standard chaplain has got a bit of a big tactical rock going on, and at least compared with some of other Games Workshop's more recent releases, he does feel a bit big for his base, overhanging it quite a lot. Definitely looking the part though, with a bunch of scrolls flowing from his body. The Primaris one gets a big and heavy duty Absolver bolt pistol. His Crozius is a little bit more simplistic, and I do quite like the hooded helm that he's got, makes him look all very sinister indeed. If you are wanting Primaris chaplains, there is another sculpt available, the one that came out in the Indomitus box, that's still on sale from Games Workshop from that Honoured of the Chapter box. Finally, we have the Primaris chaplain on bike, a sculpt that a lot of people just really quite liked when it came out. A lot of people were sad to see the biker characters taken away in 8th edition, so having one comes back and in rather spectacular badass glory did go down very well indeed. I really do like this one, very characterful miniature. He's got that great big book chained to his bike as well, and he is one of the more popular chaplains to field in game as well. The mobility and the extra toughness of the bike being really good things to get those litanies exactly where they need to be in the middle of the fight. Space Marine Captains next, and perhaps the most archetypical Space Marine leader. We've already seen the standard firstborn one that they've got available. Currently that's only the one that comes in that Command Squad box set that we talked about in the Elite section. I think it was a bit sad when they retired the standard firstborn captain that did have quite a lot of range and melee weapon options. For standalone captains, besides ones that you might kit bash, they now only have the Primaris type on offer. 4 different flavours, all currently with their own rules and datasheets: a standard one, a big one with Gravis armour and a heavy bolt rifle, a Gravis armoured one with the option of several different melee weapons, and the sneaky Phobos captain with his camo cloak and a long-ranged gun. All of them currently cost the standard price for Games Workshop's big characters, £24, $38 or €31.50, generally in the kind of mid-range in terms of points per dollar, and I feel like they're all fairly cool sculpts to be honest. The standard Primaris captain has the option of a chainsword and a bolt gun. I think he looks the part as your standard Space Marine leader, and the kit also has the option to field him with a bare head and have him pointing his finger rather than hefting that sword. For standard Primaris captains, you also have the option of the one that comes in the Elite starter set, the one with the big relic shield with the skeleton on and the mastercrafted power sword. Next up, there's the heavy bolt rifle captain that came out alongside the heavy intercessors. He's a big chunky Gravis guy, and his miniature was quite well received. That gun does look pretty cool to be honest, even though weirdly it's still the power sword that you have to fear more from him. Next up is the more standard Gravis captain. This one came out to replace the old Monopose one that was in the Dark Imperium box set. He comes with a Boltstorm gauntlet in his left hand, and the right one now has the option of a few different melee weapons. You can either take a chainsword, mastercrafted power sword, or another power fist, and the weapons are somewhat balanced against each other, with his downloadable datasheet with the Gravis pattern fighting styles. Again, I think he's really quite a nice sculpt for a Space Marine captain. I like the great big oversized combat weapons, really big power armor, and some nice servo skulls giving the miniature a bit of height. Finally, we've got the sneaky Phobos captain, perhaps a thematic option for a Raven Guard commander or something. He's armed with a weapon that can snipe enemy characters, though I must admit it's pretty disappointing not to have any sort of good combat weapon on a Space Marine character. It really does feel like you're wasting the melee potential for him. In any case though, a good fun themed scouty type choice if you are running an army full of Phobos Marines. Not to be outdone by their commanders-in-chief, Games Workshop also has plenty of Primaris Lieutenants on the go. In reality, if you have the full range of Primaris Lieutenants, there's far more than this. Plenty of them were released as special edition options, or are locked to some of the Combat Patrol or starter sets. These are the ones that you can buy from Games Workshop though. I thought I might mention the Dark Angels and Blood Angels ones, as I feel like they're kind of plain enough to be adapted to multiple chapters if you wanted to. First up, and perhaps most distinctive, is the Phobos Lieutenant with the combat blade and bolt pistol. He's basically in the Reaver style with the half skull mask and gets access to some of their stratagems. Technically, I think I have made a small error on this slide. He's technically the Reaver Lieutenant. The Phobos one is in the Space Marine starter set, but they are basically both in Phobos armor. Quite a fun model with a dynamic pose and a spoke bomb though, not really any major options on the kit. Next up is the standard Primaris Lieutenant. This one's got a power sword, and I must admit, while he looks okay, I do feel like he's so easily kit bashed from something like a standard intercessor box that I wouldn't normally bother with this guy. Just kit bash a fancy power sword onto an intercessor sergeant, maybe find an alternate head or something, and you've basically got something that's just as good. Then again, and not too dissimilarly, are the Dark Angels and Blood Angels lieutenants. Again, they're both armed with power swords, and the Dark Angels one gets a plasma pistol. Quite nice to see a rogue Primaris Marine on the Dark Angel side. I think that's quite fun. But again, I'd say that both of them aren't really the biggest and most outstanding miniatures from standard Primaris intercessors. At least the lieutenants are all a little bit cheaper than their captain equivalents, though I do feel that all the models are just a little bit on the less impressive side as well, maybe besides the Reaver one. Next up for the Space Marine characters, we have our lineup of librarians. 4 different versions on offer, and all of these are plastic. A standard librarian with a pet cherub friend, the Primaris librarian, the sneaky Phobos pattern librarian, and the Blood Angels librarian in Terminator armor. Again, a chapter specific one that I think is worth a mention, as the unique iconography isn't super standout. In general, the librarians tend to be a little bit cheaper than most of the other characters, though the standard Primaris librarian is on a par with the captains. All of them I think are pretty reasonable sculpts in their own right. The standard Firstborn one is armed with a force staff and has that fun cherub. The Primaris one I think is quite a fun sculpt, with his outstretched hands no doubt about to smite the enemy with some warp fire. The Phobos Librarian looks all very sinister, and I think is a model that went down very well with the community. Looks like he's tapping into some mental reserves to manipulate the minds of his opponents maybe. And the Terminator option is looking all very mighty, a great big force axe plus a combi melter. And as a librarian he's showing off one of his books on his backpack. Finally, for generic Space Marine characters in plastic, we have these Heresy era character kits. Again, a bit more aimed at the Horus Heresy, but out of these 3 of them could stand in pretty nicely for captains or lieutenants, and I think that the console is a bit of a nice snazzy chaplain miniature with a bit of a different vibe. First up, we've got this console and Praetor kit for £32, $55, or €42.50. Not too bad for 2 character miniatures, particularly as we've seen over the last few slides. Usually GW tends to sell a single one for upwards of £20, so getting 2 for just over 30 isn't the worst. The Terminator Praetor maybe is a little bit on the simplistic side I guess, armed with a melter pistol and a chain fist. I think the console is pretty cool with his Mark IV Maximus armor head, a different sort of vibe of chaplain if you want to go a little bit away from the skulls motif. And then they also sell separately these 2 different Legion Praetors that came out in their Age of Darkness box set. Both of these don't have any specific Legion or chapter heraldry on them, so they can be fielded in any, and I think both of them are really quite characterful miniatures to have leading an army. The big axe could maybe stand in for a relic blade. I would bear in mind you might need to convert the pistol for the chap with the sword though, as you can't field Volkite ones in 40k. The Praetors on the right are a little bit on the cheaper side, £19, $33.50 or €24. That's a price for one of them, not for 2. A bit cheaper than most of the other characters at least, if you do like their vibe. Finally, while we're on characters, I thought I might well mention the Jump Packs upgrade that you can get for them. I don't think it's especially well known, but Games Workshop does sell this little Jump Pack kit 5 different plastic basic jump packs for £5, $9 or €70, and these are basically the reason that you can still field firstborn characters with jump packs in 40k, as they technically do make a model for it. As any sort of kit from Games Workshop goes, this is about as cheap as they sell anything for these days. Not the worst investment if you're thinking about kit bashing some jump pack characters, I suppose. Otherwise, you could get some slightly more ornate ones from the Vanguard Veteran kit, or maybe the Blood Angels Death Company one. Finally, I thought we'd round up with the big combination kits, anything which is basically a box set of multiple different units smashed together. The majority of them are combat patrols and starter boxes, but there are a few other interesting ones, such as this Honoured of the Chapter box, basically one of the sprues from the Indomitus box set, and almost costing as much as the Indomitus box set did, at £90, $150 and €120. In the box you get a Primaris Chaplain, a Blade Guard Ancient with the standard, a Primaris Judicio with his Hourglass and Executioner Blade, 3 of the Monopose Blade Guard Veterans without any additional options, and 3 Eradicators with standard melter rifles. Perhaps notably in the box, the Judicio and the Blade Guard Ancient can't be got anywhere else, so it's either get this set or find one second hand on eBay from someone who had Indomitus. The price really does feel quite high for only 9 models, though as 3 of them are characters, it isn't actually the worst points per dollar value in the game. Plus the 2 squads are quite elite. Even if you valued the characters on the lower end of what Games Workshop typically sells them for, this box would still represent at least a small discount of buying the kits separately, though obviously with the Eradicators and Blade Guard you don't get the full multi-part set. As a box set, it is a bit of a weird mix of models: an HQ slot, 2 elite characters, 1 elite unit and 1 heavy support unit. It's basically a lot more indicative of which sprue came in the Indomitus box, as opposed to any specific planning on Games Workshop's part for selling the models together. In general though, despite being monopose, I think they all are pretty nice Primaris sculpts, pretty cool models and generally quite effective in game. Eradicators and Blade Guard are both good, they're all at least usable. Moving on, we have the Combat Patrol boxes. I thought we'd talk through all the faction specific ones as well, as in reality the vast majority of them right now are standard Primaris Space Marine boxes with different upgrade sprues thrown in. The generic Combat Patrol box set though for Space Marines is the Phobos themed one, £90, $150 and €120 like the rest, gets you around about 620 points worth of models in game, so it comes out as quite a good points per dollar ratio like most of the combat patrols. In this box you get the Phobos Lieutenant with the Deep Strike Jump Pack, 10 Sneaky Troops Infiltrators, 3 Eliminators armed only with Bolt Sniper Rifles, 3 Suppressors with the Jump Packs and Autocannons, and 1 Impulsor. And bear in mind that besides the Impulsor, all the rest of them are monopose models that can't be built differently. You can't choose to assemble the Eliminators with las fusils, for example. As it goes, it is a relatively cheap and easy way to get a lot of Space Marines on the table, and fairly recent quite nice sculpts as well, hailing from mid-8th edition or later. If you don't mind too much about them being monopose, it equates to around about a 43% discount from Games Workshop compared with the kit separately, which is quite good for them based on their combat patrols. Another interesting thing is that this is the only way that you can get those suppressors with the jump packs and the autocannons, and it's the only place that you can get the Phobos Lieutenant, so both of those are minor selling points of the box, even if maybe they're not super strong units in game right now. I think perhaps the biggest issue with this thing is whether or not you like the Spec Ops Phobos vibe for your Space Marine army, or you want to go a bit more down the Knights in Space or brutal close combat or heavy weapons type approach. The Impulsor also feels like it's not a particularly good fit, as it doesn't really have any units that it really wants to transport. The Infiltrators will be far happier deployed on foot, maybe scouting out the enemy. Overall, most of the units are at least usable in the box though, and I think that both the Eliminators and the Infiltrators are quite good. Next up we have Combat Patrol Blood Angels. As I mentioned, the faction specific ones are generally just standard Primaris Marines with a couple of tiny upgrade sprues thrown in that you don't need to use if you don't want to. For the same price, the Blood Angels one gets you another Impulsor, 5 Intercessors, 5 Incursors or Infiltrators, 3 Aggressors and a Primaris Librarian, and this time all the kits are the multi-part ones that you can build in either variation. Say for example, the Incursors can be built as Infiltrators, and the Aggressors can take the Boltstorm Gauntlet loadout. I think this actually does really quite a good job as a general purpose Start Space Marines box set. It doesn't feel enormously Blood Angels without any of their unique things like Death Company or Sanguinary Guard, but you do get a bunch of fun units, a squad of elites and a transport. The discount's around about 34% compared with the kit separately, which again is fairly good from Games Workshop, and in general I'd say that most of the units are at least usable in game. perhaps the troops being particularly handy to fill out battalions and stuff. Next we have the Combat Patrol Space Wolves, again the same price for around 540 points. This one's got an Invicta Tactical Warsuit, 10 Intercessors, 5 Reavers that you can also field as Hounds of Morkai, and a slightly more themed battle leader that's basically a Primaris Lieutenant with Space Wolves vibes. If you ignore the upgrades for this one really doesn't give you quite as much of a good deal as the Blood Angels, only around 20% off compared with the separate. For me, I feel like this just depends on how much you want the Invicta Warsuit and the Reavers. They're going to be the difference between whether or not this box is a good deal for you. And bear in mind that the Lieutenant Battle Leader is fairly Space Wolf themed as well. Maybe it wouldn't be quite the most obvious if painted in a different colour scheme, but the wolf pelts might not be quite right for every chapter. Next up, the Combat Patrol Dark Angels box set I think is quite a good one. It does leave you with a little bit less points than some of the others at only 480, and the discount again isn't super amazing for a Combat Patrol, at being just over 20 if you ignore the upgrade sprues. In the box though, you get the Redemptor Dreadnought, 3 Inceptors, 5 Intercessors, and a Chaplain, all of which I think are pretty decent usable units for Space Marines. Particularly the Redemptor Dreadnought is a nice one to have to do some heavy lifting. The Dark Angels upgrades do give you the option of giving a power sword for your squad sergeant as well. Again though, I would say that this is just a really good general purpose box for starting Space Marines in general, a bunch of units that are really quite core to the army, and it certainly doesn't hurt to get them at a slight discount. Next up, there's the Deathwatch Combat Patrol. Again, this one's a bit on the lower point side at 480 again. In this one you get 3 Aggressors, 10 Intercessors, an Apothecary and a Lieutenant. The discount's worth at around about 18%, again if you ignore the Deathwatch upgrade sprues, which might be handy if you are playing Deathwatch to be fair, for those nice Litany Xena Mortis shoulder pads. But beyond that, I really am not the biggest fan of this one. My biggest criticism of this one is that even with a small discount, a lot of the value is tied up in those 2 pricey characters, and as I mentioned earlier, the standard Lieutenant just isn't really that distinct from a normal Intercessor Sergeant, and you could kit bash one with a power sword pretty easily. For that reason, I think unless I was actually playing Deathwatch, I'd probably not bother with these, and either get one of the other Combat Patrol box sets, or just my choice of units that weren't quite so limited to the ones set here. Finally, for the Combat Patrols, and the most themed out of any of them, is the one for the Black Templars. This one is really quite a faction-themed one, and isn't generally usable, the main reason being that it comes with a Black Templar Crusader squad, which with its Primaris Neophytes can't be fielded with other chapters. If you are playing Black Templars though, then it's interesting enough. You get 5 Intercessors, 10 Crusader Squad Marines, a Black Templar Marshal, an Impulsor, and the rather generous Black Templar upgrade sprue. So it isn't a bad way to get started for your Knightly Crusaders. The discount is fairly good, around about 29% compared with the kits separately, and if you are playing Black Templars, the extra theming towards your chapter is kind of nice. I'd say probably the least helpful thing in the box are maybe the Intercessors. I sort of feel when you've already got one quite big themed troops choice, you just don't really need more Primaris bodies on there, and it might have been fun to have a more elite unit, but still I guess generally more Primaris bodies are generally kind of useful. I would say that the upgrade sprue is a particularly good selling point as well, as that one is handy. It gives you some genuine different war gear options, like shotguns for the neophytes, a multi-melter that you can put on other vehicles, and fun little relic bearer upgrades to represent bits from their codex. Leaving Combat Patrols behind next, and seeing as they contain Space Marines, I thought we'd just quickly cover the 40k starter sets and the Age of Darkness box for Heresy, all of which are some of the best discounts on miniatures that you can get from Games Workshop. Starting out, the Recruit starter set is £32.50, $50 or €40. For the Space Marines it gets you that rather nice Primaris Lieutenant with the shield and the Neo-Volkite pistol, plus 5 Assault Intercessors. You also get some Necrons with it, Royal Warden, 10 Warriors and 3 Scarabs. And overall, if you do count the Necrons, then the points per dollar ratio is the best out of any of the kits that we've talked about, 8.6, not bad when a typical Space Marine average is somewhere around 3. Models wise, I'd bear in mind that the Assault Intercessors are the monopose ones, they aren't the full kit with other Sergeant weapons, though it's not too hard to kit bash them if you do have some spare melee things lying around. Discount wise, it equates to around about a 65% discount compared with buying the miniatures separately, assuming the lowest price for the characters. And again, that really is a number that you don't often get from Games Workshop. This kit is about one of the best deals in Warhammer going at the moment. Obviously, it does come with the downside that it's a split faction box. If you just collect Space Marines and have no interest in Necrons, it's far less value unless you can split it or resell the Crons. But even then, it's really not the worst deal just for the Space Marines alone, and having a few extra Xenos Warriors to paint up isn't the worst thing in the world. If you want more models though, then there's also the option of the Elite starter set, slightly expanding the forces on both sides and swapping out the characters. The Elite set again is priced fairly aggressively for how many models you get in it, £65, $99 or €80. You still have the Necron Warriors, Scarabs and Assault Intercessors, but leading the forces you have a Necron Lord versus a Space Marine Captain, and some Outriders and Scorpec Destroyers for some bigger hitters. On the Space Marine side, the Outriders are no different to the kit that they sell separately, admittedly quite a basic kit, but if you were thinking about picking up the Outriders box anyway, I don't think it's the worst stretch to go to this kit, as it just contains so much value. The Space Marine Captain is the one with the Relic Storm Shield plus the Relic Power Sword. Quite an imposing model, and not too bad in game with a 2+ save and a good invul. Points per dollar wise, it's up at a 6.9, again far beyond just about everything else you get, provided you include the Necrons. It's around about a 58% saving from Games Workshop's from the same kit separately, almost as good as the slightly godly Recruit box, and in general I think it's a very solid pickup if you're getting into 40k. I won't actually mention it in its own slide, but you do also have the option of the Command box as well. That's an expanded one if you want some battlefield terrain and the main 9th rulebook as well. I'd see that as an upgrade on the Elite set if you do want those extra bits at the extra price it would cost you. Finally, and concluding our odyssey through just about every Space Marine kit that Games Workshop sells, we have the Age of Darkness box set, a fairly recent release aimed at Games Workshop's Horus Heresy game. But to be honest, if you do want to start Firstborn Space Marines, this is one way to get an awful lot of models on the table, and for a lot cheaper than Games Workshop would normally sell them for separately. The box is a really big meaty one, it's £180, $299 or €225, so it's very much not a small purchase, but Games Workshop doesn't really offer that many sets that are basically an entire 40k army in one box. You can get around about 1900 to 2000 points in the box, giving it a very good points per dollar ratio, and contents wise you get a Spartan tank, a Contemptor Dreadnought, 10 Cataphracta Terminators, a big 40 of the Mark 6 Space Marines with the chain bayonets and beaky helms, the 2 character Praetors, and also the Horus Heresy rulebook and some gaming aids. In theory, if you wanted to play the Horus Heresy as well, it could be a decent starter point to both systems. There are certainly admitting game terms that most of the models contained wouldn't be super strong in 40k. It's far more tactical marines than you'd realistically want in a list, though the Relic Terminators and Contemptor Dreadnought and maybe the characters all could have some very good use. For other thoughts, you could maybe combine it with the heavy weapons upgrades to make some of those tactical marines into Devastators with missiles or heavy bolters, and it would bear in mind that you could potentially either resell some bits that you don't want on eBay, or potentially pick up individual bits of this kit on eBay, as basically everything will be going for a bit of a discounted price for people who just don't want one bit, or splitting up this kit just in general to make a profit. You can certainly get some pretty cheap Spartan tanks and Mark 6 Marines if you want to pick them up. Overall, I think that this one's a really big investment. I don't think it'll be for everyone who don't want this exact mix of units and things, but it's certainly one way to get an awful lot of plastic Space Marines on the board for less price than Games Workshop would usually charge you for them. So there we have it then, just about every kit in the Space Marine range reviewed, besides the chapter specific ones, which maybe we'll get round to covering in another video at some stage. This one has been a very big project, so I hope that's been at least of some use to some of you guys. Games Workshop's Space Marine range has certainly got a bit on the beefy side over the years. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. If this video winds up being popular, I might well make a fair few more like it, taking a look at the other armies in 40k and what kits Games Workshop sells for them. Finally, if you have got some good value out of this video, I would just like to briefly mention the Auspex Tactics Patreon page, which you can find linked in the video description below. Making enormous projects like this wouldn't be possible without the support of people who back the channel on Patreon. It allows me the time to make these videos as my main full-time thing. If the video has helped you and given you some good value, then any support is massively appreciated, as it will be what allows me to keep on making new videos like this on the channel. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.